Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review, Unit 11 on imperialism up through the Spanish-American War and World War I. Looking at the review sheet from top to bottom, reasons for imperialism. Remember, this is an age worldwide of imperialism, and American ideas about imperialism are going to coincide with what's going on globally. One of the reasons for imperialism is the pursuit of status. To own colonies confers glory, confers recognition that you are a player, that you are a power. Another reason is military bases to protect global trade. You have other maybe after the fact rationalizations, and that is to civilize and Christianize, quote unquote, the natives. The Spanish-American War, reasons why the U.S. went to war. Well, the Cuban people rose up in 1896 against the Spanish, and the Spanish pursued a policy of putting the Cubans in what were called reconcentration camps, where over 100,000 Cubans had died of exposure and disease and malnutrition. So there was concern by the Americans of the mistreatment of the Cubans by Spain. There's also this desire to get some territory like the rest of Europe is doing as they're expanding in particular into Africa and Asia. But specifically, the United States is going to blame Spain for the explosion that blows up the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. And the belief is that Spain did this, that Spain provoked us. New territories acquired in the Spanish-American War are Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. And keep in mind, Cuba, after a few years, will get its independence. And that's via the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment to the war resolution says this is not a war of imperialist aggression against Cuba. Now, Cuba will be forced to put in their constitution what's called the Platt Amendment, and that gives the United States the right to intervene should there be chaos or anarchy or civil war or danger to Americans, citizens, or property. So again, Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific. Territories also acquired, though not from Spain, in 1898 are Hawaii and then later Samoa. Why no freedom for the Philippines, especially after the Filipinos asked for it? Well, Emilio Aguinaldo is going to lead a 4-year rebellion against the American military that's going to lead to 100,000 Filipino dead and about 4,000 American soldiers dead, as many as die in the Spanish-American War itself. And the bottom line, well, I don't know if there's a bottom line as much as maybe there's a few things here. One is a realistic fear that other countries may take over the Philippines if we walk away, and that would be perhaps Japan or Germany, that we had an obligation to protect the Filipinos from other predatory nations, us being less predatory than the others. There is the argument for trade, that the Philippines is a fine base to expand trade into Asia, in particular China, and then the need to civilize the Filipino people. And this is one of the reasons given by McKinley. He felt it was only proper, it was only right that the Filipinos are tutored by us in democracy before they would get their independence. So remember, the Teller Amendment gives Cuba its independence almost right away, and the Platt Amendment gives us permission to intervene in Cuba. And one of the things we got was military bases. Keep in mind, we still have Guantanamo Bay as an American military base in communist Cuba as of this taping in 2018. The Anti-Imperialist League. This is an organization of Americans. Some of the ones who are more famous are former Presidents Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland. You have Mark Twain. You have Andrew Carnegie. And the arguments against imperialism are that this is contrary to American democratic ideals to take people over without their permission, that it may get us into war with other countries, and it's a little prescient here. We do go to war in the Philippines against the Japanese, who invade it and take it off from us shortly after Pearl Harbor. And then there's the racist argument that we don't want anything to do with these people. We don't want them to be certainly immigrating to the United States. Hawaii and Liliuokalani, remember, sugar planters overthrow the last independent queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, offered the Hawaii to President Cleveland, who says this is wrong and refuses to accept Hawaii. Hawaii is later going to be annexed by McKinley. Socialist Eugene Debs on imperialism. The Marxist position on imperialism is that it is the next logical part of capitalist expansion after the local workers in factories have been exploited, and that this is a way to reduce tension at home. And Debs is going to argue during World War I that this war is essentially a sucker's war. This is a war, capitalist war, and at the expense of proletarian laborers who are being exploited, who have nothing really to fight each other about. And the Germans and the French and the Russians and such, and the Americans should make common cause, and basically our beef is against capitalism and not against any particular nation. Eugene Debs is going to be thrown into prison under the Sedition Act towards the end of World War I. He's going to get a 10-year term. Reasons for acquiring the Panama Canal, how we got it. Well, the Panama Canal's purpose was so that the American Navy could get back and forth between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans more quickly than going all the way around South America. In particular, we need to get our fleet out to, say, the Philippines, because this is now part of an American Pacific Empire. We acquired the Panama Canal by supporting a Panamanian revolution against Colombia. This was one of many revolutions. Often the history books portray this as being opportunistic, which perhaps it is, but the Panamanians are continuously rebelling. They're sort of a distant province of Colombia, and we are going to, in return for supporting them, the WWI Treaty is going to give the United States the right to build a canal and to control a canal zone 10 miles on each side. And Mr. Bruno Varilla is going to sign for the Panamanians. He's the representative of the defunct French canal company that failed to build a canal under the French. The president at this time is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. Big stick diplomacy. This is this idea of, speak quietly, carry a big stick. The idea is if you have a big military, and specifically at this time, a big navy, other nations will respect you, will respect us. And the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is that Latin America and the Caribbean are our backyard, therefore we are the police, we are the gendarme, we're the cop, we will keep order. And in 1907 and 1909, Teddy Roosevelt sends 16 battleships on a tour around the world as a display of American strength. And in 1903, the United States is going to send troops to the Dominican Republic to force them to forcibly collect tariffs and to turn this money over to the Europeans who are threatening to invade the DR. And again, we are going to be that in-between party between the Europeans who, under the Monroe Doctrine, we don't want them having anything to do with Latin America, but we are going to correct wrongdoing. And the Dominicans owe money, and we're going to collect it. We're sort of the repo man. Dollar diplomacy, under which president? This would be William Howard Taft, and what is it? Dollar diplomacy is this idea we can have influence in Latin America through economic investment, through the purchase of things like plantations, sugar plantations, banana plantations, investments in things like railroads and perhaps electric companies, and that this is both a beneficial way of helping Latin America, but it's also a way to align their interests with ours, not using violence. Missionary diplomacy. This is the policy, the nickname of the policy under Woodrow Wilson, that we will oppose dictators and we will be in opposition to non-democratic leaders. Specifically in Mexico, General Huerta overthrows and kills President Madero. And there's several revolutionaries that we're giving weapons to, including Pancho Villa. And Wilson is adamant. We will, in fact, he's got a famous quote, "We will teach them to elect good men." And we do send soldiers to Veracruz to stop weapons coming from Germany in 1914 to this dictator, General Huerta. The Boxer Rebellion, where, why, and the U.S. response. The Boxer Rebellion is between 1899 and 1901 in China. The Boxer, one of the translations of the Boxers, is the Society of Harmonious and Righteous Fighting Fists, and it's this idea, if you do these martial arts, it will protect you from Western bullets, and the Boxers are anti-foreign, anti-colonial, anti-Christian. They're angry at these treaty ports and the Chinese being pushed around, and they're going to attack Chinese Christians, and they're going to attack the foreign embassies in, or what are called the legations, in Beijing. And an 8-nation army, including about several thousand U.S. Marines, are going to be sent to the rescue successfully of these legations in Beijing, and the Boxers are going to be crushed. But again, this shows American muscle flexing, that we're part of an international contingent to put down rebellion against Western influence. 1910 through 1920, Mexican Revolution. This revolution is tearing Mexico apart for about a decade here, and we are supporting opponents of General Huerta. And one of these guys is Pancho Villa. And after Huerta is defeated, we're going to cut off arms that are going to Pancho Villa, and he's going to cross the border, and he's going to burn a place called Columbus, New Mexico, to the ground. He's going to kill about 16 Americans. And this is going to lead to Wilson sending in, I think it's about 15,000 Marines or so under General Pershing, and he's going to fail to capture Pancho Villa. The Zimmerman Telegram is in January of 1917. World War I's been going on for a while. The Germans are going to offer an alliance to the Mexicans, that if they will join Germany, Germany will send them weapons and help them reclaim the Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, this area. Now keep in mind here, there is war going on in Mexico. The Mexicans aren't going to fight us, and this isn't a temptation, but it's a provocation because we've got this violence that's spilling over our border, obviously, with the raid of Pancho Villa, and the Germans here are basically, sort of provoking war with us, really. 1918 influenza epidemic. You should be aware that there is a flu epidemic which is going to kill over 500,000 Americans over the course of a calendar year in the United States. And this is very similar to the Spanish-American War. Well, the influenza epidemic is going to kill half of all the soldiers who die in Europe. Out of the 116,000, about half of these die of flu. And how is this similar to the Spanish-American War? Well, about 90% of those who die in the Spanish-American War are going to die of mosquito-borne diseases, yellow fever and malaria and such. Only about 10% of the war deaths in the Spanish-American War are from Spanish bullets. World War I, the Lusitania. 1915, this is an English passenger ship which is sunk off the coast of Ireland, killing 128 Americans. The United States is ready for war after this slaughter of American lives. But Woodrow Wilson keeps us out of war. He has a saying that there's such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. And William Jennings Bryan, who's going to be the Secretary of State, is going to resign. He feels that Wilson's threat to Germany is so antagonistic, so provocative, so bellicose, that this is just short of a declaration of war, which it isn't. We stay out of war for the next 2 years here. But Wilson is going to demand that the Germans not sink ships with Americans on them, that they respect neutrals aboard transatlantic shipping. The 1916 Democratic campaign slogan is "He kept us out of war." Wilson kept the United States out of war for basically the first 3 out of this 4-year war. And question here that the AP has asked at least once, how is the U.S. not really neutral? And it can be argued that even though we're not specifically sending soldiers, 1914, 15, 16, pulling triggers and shooting artillery at the Germans, that we are selling supplies to the Brits and to the French, that we are tolerant of the British blockade of Germany. Certainly there's nothing we can do about it, and that Americans are not selling much to Germany, and Germans can't get their ships past this mighty British Navy. So it's been argued that our loans, that our war supplies, our food, our weapons are going to Great Britain and France as fast as we can produce them and ship them. Why did the U.S. enter the Great War, or World War I? Well, in spring of 1917, the Germans are going for broke. They launch unrestricted submarine warfare, which earlier, after the Sussex Pledge, they said they would not do. And what's happened here in 1917 is the Germans are winning the war. Russia has pulled out. They've had a communist revolution. Millions of German soldiers are moving from the eastern to the western front. And the plan here is to smash the British, to smash the French before the Americans can make it. And the Germans lose this gamble. Several million fresh, confident, perhaps naive American soldiers are going to be going ashore. And this is going to give a morale boost to the Allies. It's going to be a huge morale depressant to the Germans. Making the world safe for democracy. This is the motto of Wilson, part of this missionary diplomacy. And the larger picture here is we're going to war to make the world safe for freedom and democracy. 14 points are Wilson's peace plan, and the Germans will surrender. The Germans will sue for peace. They are going to sign an armistice on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. And what's interesting is none of this war is fought in Germany. It's kind of an incredible defeat for the Germans, and largely they feel that Wilson, in his 14 points, is arguing for peace without victories, arguing for an end to war without winners, without losers. Very naive here. The Brits and the French and the Italians are going to ask for severe punishment against the Germans. But one of the things that Wilson wants that does end up in the Versailles Treaty is a League of Nations, which he believes is the area where nations can talk and avoid future wars. The big four at Versailles are the Brits, the French, the Italians, and the Americans. The Germans are not invited. They are basically told to take it or leave it. The Allied army is fully armed and ready to resume the war. The British fleet is starving. About 750,000 people die of hunger, of starvation in Germany because of this blockade. Germany does not grow enough food to feed itself, neither do the Brits, but the Germans throw in the towel first. And keep in mind also here, the German army, the German navy, German cities are seeing mutinies and riots, food riots, bread riots, and the Germans collapse, in part because of American soldiers showing up, in part because of this feeling that Wilson is going to leash the Allies and is going to give the Germans a good deal, which is not the case, unfortunately, for Germany. The reaction to the Versailles Treaty. Wilson signs this treaty, but remember, the U.S. Senate has to ratify it. And Wilson doesn't take over any Republicans. He's insulted the Republican Party here. And this is not a Democratic or Republican war. This is a war fought by all Americans. And Wilson, totally lacking in savvy, does not bring representatives from the other political party. Remember, he's a Democrat. He won in 1912 and 1916. But the big thing here is Wilson's baby is the League of Nations, and the Republican senators are very reluctant. They're in opposition to a League of Nations which can send American troops and violate American sovereignty against America's will. And Henry Cabot Lodge, his reservations, he's going to say we'll sign this with the condition that no Americans go off to combat without permission from the U.S. Congress. And Wilson feels this totally is going to gut the power of this league. And he's going to go over the Senate's head. He's going to go on a speaking tour out west. He's going to collapse, have a stroke, and he's going to spend the last year and a half or so of his term in the White House failing to get the Versailles Treaty ratified. Americans, a few years later, are going to sign a separate treaty with the Germans. Women during World War I. You may be familiar with Rosie the Riveter in World War II. Well, women are also working in industry during World War I, taking the jobs of these millions of men who've gone off to fight. The Espionage Act in 1917 says it's against the law to interfere with recruitment for the war. And this is upheld by Schenck versus the U.S. This is a Supreme Court case that says that if there is a clear and present danger about ready to be perpetrated, the government can step in, and that clear and present danger is the Socialist Party interfering with American recruitment. And the specific incident here is the Shank situation. About 15,000 anti-war flyers are being mailed, are being delivered to those who are up for induction into the military via conscription. And this is seen as being basically playing into the hands of the Germans. The Sedition Act of 1918, passed under Wilson, says you cannot be disrespectful use disrespectful language against the U.S. government, its institutions, excuse me, its symbols, its president. The postmaster can stop mail, and about 1,000 socialists are going to be thrown in jail, including, remember, Eugene Debs. He's going to run for office from a federal prison in 1920. He's going to get many hundreds of thousands of votes while he's in prison. Government intervention in the economy during World War I. You have the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which are going to restrict free speech. You have conscription. You're going to have about 5 million Americans who will either be drafted or who are going to volunteer for the war. You have the Committee of Public Information, which is a propaganda agency which is going to help put movie shorts at the beginning of films, is going to put up posters saying, you know, beat the Hun and buy Liberty bonds. And you have the leader of the CPI, the Committee of Public Information Propaganda Office, run by the government, is a guy named George Creel, C-R-E-E-L. The War Industry Board is going to manage the economy. It's not going to be socialism. You don't have the factories literally taken over, but you do have the factories directed to be to produce military material rather than civilian goods. So you have Detroit turning out artillery pieces and guns rather than cars and toasters. You have the trains are also, by the WIB, the War Industry Board, are told where to pick up raw goods and where to move stuff between factories and to move soldiers ahead of civilians. So the economy is hugely disrupted by this war. The U.S. government basically tells big business what to make, where to move it, how, and when. The entry of the U.S. on the Great War's outcome. I tell my classes I was at the at the Verdun battlefield, and I bought some history books that were published in Great Britain, and they barely recognized the United States contribution to World War I at all. The thinking being that only about 2% of those who die in this war are Americans. This is largely a war which is using French and British and Russian blood. Now, the counter-argument here is, even though the Americans did not do most of the fighting, our several million-man army that shows up fresh and ready and eager to fight, well-equipped, is a morale boost, and that it is a disincentive. It is it throws Germany into psychological depression that all of a sudden there are these millions of Americans, these Yanks, showing up. American soldiers do fill in the gaps in the British offensive against the Western Front. U.S. credit and weapons and food are going to be supplying the Allied army. And but again, the U.S., the number here is approximately 116,000 dead. Now keep in mind, half of these are flu deaths, but out of about 18 million deaths in this war, this is just a pittance. So there you have it. Here's some thoughts on the unit on overseas American intervention in the Spanish-American War, in World War I, and in Mexico, China, and in Panama. So good luck in your studies, all, and I'm signing out.